So, whoops, let me go back. Just to, we've got a new person with us as well, helping out in the chat today. Connor. Connor did his thesis on development. So we asked him to come in and help with the chat, as this is really, really his thing. So we're talking today about cultural heritage and development. And, you know, development is, I'm sure that we've got in this session, we've got people who will say, oh, no, development. And then people who think that development is just wonderful and it's going to resolve our problems, because that's really the situation. There is no one way of looking at this. Development has often been seen as the enemy of cultural heritage and something that, you know, has caused massive destruction of cultural heritage. And then there are ways of using cultural heritage in development, which are, you know, have been very successful and have rebooted an economy and hold out a lot of hope for the future. So there's kind of one end where it's, you know, the enemy, and there's the other end where it's just marvelous. And then there's kind of like every stage in between, shall we say, of that, you know, and whether you view it as a positive thing or a negative thing is going to depend absolutely on your situation. So you will all have different situations. But let's have a look. What we're going to start to do is look a little bit at the sort of history of how heritage and development have got along together and the accommodations that have had to be made. So this is a slide I used in last week's tourism lecture. So it's making a return performance because I really love it. It's a beautiful painting. It's Goethe, the great German scholar, who is lounging nonchalantly against Roman remains. And he's in Campania, which is the area around Rome, the countryside around Rome. And this absolutely sums up this romantic view of the past. He is in the sort of ancient world, but it's a world that's untouched by modernity. It's untouched by modern life. And this is very much what people in the 18th and 19th century wanted. And they did really leave to us as a legacy a kind of idea of how we should look at the past, which is often very nostalgic, very, it's looking back on it through, you know, as a time when everything was better. We always have to be a little bit wary of presenting history in this way, as looking back on a period when everything was good and compares to our period where we are now, which is nowhere near as good, which is very flawed and, you know, hasn't got the purity of the past. We have to be a little bit wary of doing that, because almost certainly, you know, we're really inventing this past. You know, I think in reality, very few of us would really like to live in the past. I mean, you know, I only need to mention a few things to make you think how awful it would be. Dentists, for one. I don't think any of us would want to live in a world without dentists or bathrooms or, you know, hospitals or what have you. So it wasn't, you know, we mustn't get too romantic about it. But there is a great tendency to do this and to project onto the past a kind of perfection that is missing in our own society. Of course, in order to do this, you have to make sure that your modernity doesn't impinge on that. And so there's tended to be an idea of having the past that separates the modern life from the past. And we've tended to think that if you've got monuments that are old, what you should do is like put a barrier around them, keep them as old, not necessarily use them, but keep them as some sort of pristine idea of what the past was like. And that has been very much the approach to heritage. And this became particularly marked during the Industrial Revolution. It was really during the Industrial Revolution that we started to worry so much about our history and our heritage, because, of course, you never worry about anything so much as when you're about to lose it. And during the Industrial Revolution, when all these cherished old buildings were pulled down, and when environmental beauty spots were built over, people began to say, we must do something to protect this. So most of the organizations that we have that have grown up today have their roots in a movement that developed in really the mid-19th century, going into the early 20th century, where there was this desire to protect heritage from more destruction. And this encouraged the growth of heritage societies and environmental protectionism, such as, for example, the National Trust in Britain and in America, historic preservation societies, preserving historic houses, and of course the development of the national park system, which we've mentioned before. And this idea of having to protect the historic past and keep it separate from modern development. Well, that became particularly important in the Second World War after during the period of the 1960s, when there begins to be this economic post-war revival. And again, it feels like the historic centres are being threatened by this. And in 1960 in Italy, there was passed something that became very central to our concept of looking at heritage, and it was called the Gubio Charter. And it really aimed to recreate the romantic approach of the 19th century. That is, to keep the historic areas separate from modern development, and to put them in verdant spaces and put trees in, to make it into a nice romantic area. And it was the Gubio Charter that coined the phrase centro storico, the historic centre. And although obviously historic centres had always been there, in a conservation and heritage sense, the centro storico has a more particular meaning. It means that you're going to treat the whole historic centre as a single monument and preserve the whole thing intact and isolate it from modern development. And in Italy, laws were passed to stop developments of the historic centres, and this approach became copied in other areas, in other countries as well. And so again, I used this slide in the tourism lecture because it gives us a fantastically visual sense of what happens when you do that. So this is Prague, and you can see that Prague has a historic centre which is intact. Then there is just outside that a kind of green belt, an area that is trees and woods and very nice. And then up on the hills in the distance, you have the modern development. And that modern development is essentially where the population of Prague now lives, because, as I mentioned last week in the tourism lecture, the centre, the historic buildings, they become often gentrified. And so the people who come to live there are often not the local community. They may well be foreigners. They may well be people who are using this as a second home or holiday home. And the problem with that is that if those people become the majority, you no longer have a local community. And in the tourism lecture last week, we looked at how this has happened to Venice and how many people think Venice is actually a lost cause, quite honestly, that there's no way of going back with Venice, that it's now a museum, it's lost its community completely. And it's not going to be possible to row back on that. We'll have to wait and see if that's the case. But there is a danger in turning cities into museums. And that is the unintended consequence, really, of the Gubio Charter. It was there to protect cities and to stop development. But if you carry on for a long period of time having no development whatsoever, then that in itself becomes a danger, because what you've got is not a living city anymore. You've got a city that's got no citizens. You've got a city that's got no community there. And that is destructive too. So there were in this period lots of national laws that were brought in to protect historic buildings. And this is particularly during the 1960s, this period of great development. And this was then also mirrored by international conventions that also, and setting up of organizations such as ECROM, such as ECOMOS, and the passing of the World Heritage Convention, all of this designed to protect this, these historic areas, which were seen as being under great threat from development. This became quite a famous book. Gavin Stamp was a very influential architectural critic, and he made the famous phrase that the post-war town planners did more damage to Britain's cities than Hitler during the Second World War. So during the second half of the 20th century, there was this idea that heritage and development were absolutely incompatible, and that the way to protect heritage was to stop development. And so they were like almost in two camps, really. Modernists who wanted to destroy heritage, people who wanted to have to keep the historic buildings at any cost, and really very polarized. And I'm just going to give one example of this, which is actually a debate which is continuing to today. So it shows you how long some of these arguments are. And I'm taking an example from my own experience here in Rome. A classic example of this was the third metro line in Rome, which has become an incredible saga. Rome is a very big city, so it's only really had for, until very recently, it's only had 2 metro lines, which is not very many for a city of this size. And in the 1990s, in fact, the idea had been raised even before then, of a third metro line, which was originally intended to be open for the 2000 Jubilee, but it didn't come anywhere close to that. Indeed, they didn't even begin the archaeological excavations, which would allow the line to be completed until 2006. So you can see how much in particular, the archaeological heritage held up all the discussions and all of the development. This is a picture of the very center of Rome, Piazza Venezia, which it is hoped that the line will eventually arrive at, but still hasn't happened. And you can see the the archaeological excavations have already been carried out. What you're looking at there is the putting in of the ventilation shafts. So you can see that this is, in fact, this was taken during lockdown. I should perhaps explain this photo because it's an extremely unusual photo. You would not normally be able to see this for the traffic that there is in Piazza Venezia, but I took it during lockdown when we weren't allowed out. I hasten to add, I was not breaking the law by going out to take this photo. I actually had to go out to go to the bank, so I was allowed out to go to the bank, and I happened to be en route through Piazza Venezia, so I took this photograph of it. But this is how long this famous line C has taken, and of course it's cost a huge amount of money. But of course there's an enormous amount at stake. This is what is under one of the stations, the house of the Praetorian Prefect. I mean, anywhere you dig in Rome, you're going to find really extensive archaeological remains. So it's a very difficult undertaking. But the thing is that there is a contemporary population of Rome, and that population has to live, you know, has to move around. So just to show you the impact of this, 10 years ago, so 2013, this was still the plan for the metro. So line A is the old line, that's in red. Line B is the old line, that's in blue. And the new line is this green one. And the idea is that it'll go to the Colosseum. It will cut right across the historic centre and go to St. Peter's is here. And this area around here is the area where all the historic buildings are and the big archaeological remains underground. So this is the idea that it would access this region. And 10 years ago, that's what it was like. This is a more recent map. This part has been done, and it said arrive next year at the Colosseum. It's always arriving next year at the Colosseum, whatever year you ask, it's always next year it's going to arrive. But as you can see, there's no real progress being done beyond that. So, and this was in fact the area that was the most important area, the area of all the historic buildings, of the big archaeological remains underground. And there's no real progress, to be honest, here. So for the moment, this is where it will be. And this is after 30 years of discussion. So that's how much it can hold up everything. For this session, I put on the videos of the building of the metro, of the new underground in London, what was called Crossrail, what's now called the Elizabeth Line. Hang on a second, oops, I'll come to that later. Just a moment, I'll go back. And one of the reasons I put that on was to show how you can use technology today and you can go about doing things differently so that you don't have this kind of delay, because it really is very damaging to the people of Rome who have not had this transport line available to them. You know, transport in Rome is very difficult. And the city centre is again suffering from gentrification, and so people are moving out. And if they're moving out to the suburbs, they need to be able to get in and out of the city. So it really is damaging to the economy to not have modern transportation. So the real issue is finding the balance between development and heritage, instead of being in two opposing camps and sort of saying, we are going to oppose you on everything you do. We need to try and find a way of moving forward. And that was very apparent to the Council of Europe, who set up the Valletta Convention in 1992, which was very groundbreaking in its way. And what was inspiring them were the figures. If we go to 1992, this is the rural and urban populations. So they were looking at this chart and they were saying very shortly, the urban population is going to overtake the rural, because throughout the world, people are moving to the cities. And so the cities have to be able to function. You have to have development in the cities. There is no way around it. As it happened, everything went a lot faster than they thought it was going to in 1992. And in the early 2000s, the urban population overtakes the rural population. And in that case, you have to have development. There isn't any option, and we have to find a way of coexisting. So the Valletta Convention was set about trying to ensure that archaeologists and developers work together in planning policies that would come up with balanced strategies to incorporate the most important heritage, to permit modification of some plans, but ultimately to allow plans to go ahead in one way or another. And it was an approach that was very much embraced by English Heritage at the time, who wanted to demonstrate that heritage could be beneficial to economic development, that also developers shouldn't just assume that the best way to deal with development is to pull down all historic buildings. Instead, you can use the historic environment to create in itself economic capital. And this was called the Heritage Dividend. And they wrote a very extensive book on how to measure it. And this is quite crucial. You know, it's all very well sort of saying, oh, we like it, it's good. But, you know, when you're in a planning meeting, you have to actually come up with some figures. You have to put numbers to this. Otherwise, your argument is very weak. And that was what English Heritage did in the Heritage Dividend. And they demonstrated that in the UK, for every £10,000 invested in the historic environment, brought in just under 5 times as much from public and private sectors, gave commercial space, brought jobs, and also brought about an improved spirit of place, which was something we talked about in the tourism session, that making everywhere unique, making it somewhere that's attractive for local people, where they feel a sense of community and they feel that it's a special place that's their place. We talked about this in relation to tourism, but actually it's even more important for local communities to have that. And I saw this actually just a few days ago in LinkedIn. David Gill posted this in his LinkedIn page, and I thought it was kind of interesting because this is the same part of Britain that the original Heritage Dividend was done in. And he was talking about a research project that's at 3 universities in the east of England, which is the University of East Anglia, University of Sussex, and University of Kent. No, sorry, University of Essex and University of Kent. And they have done an assessment of how important it is economically to have heritage in that area. And they have concluded that it contributed £11 billion to the economy and is responsible for 140,000 jobs. So that's pretty significant. So to get back to our London subway line, the tube or the underground in London, Crossrail is very much needed. It goes right across the whole of London and connects Heathrow Airport as well, which was very important. Has 2 tunnels, 118 kilometres long. It's built by these tunnel boring machines, which is how also Line C is being built, by a tunnel boring machine. The initial estimate was £14 billion. It's come in at £18.9 billion. And it employed 14,000 people. And it went through the whole of central London. But the problem is that they raised a huge amount of private finance for it, which was on loans. And if you delay a tunnelling project like this, it can cost up to £1 million a day. So you really have to make sure that you're not going to be delaying the machine. Essentially, the machine shouldn't stop once it gets going. In order to do this, and to protect the heritage, they actually did something that is very counterintuitive. They passed an act which disapplied all of the heritage protection. And the reason they did this is because, well, essentially because of the example of things like Rome's Metro Line C, because you would just never get private investment to invest in it if there was this danger that they were going to be held up in that way. And so they actually passed a law that said that they're not going to be held up. But there had to be all the heritage work had to be factored in to the initial proposal. And this was an assessment that they did in 2013 of how well this had worked. So it says the schedule disapplies the usual listed building protections that would otherwise apply. And it would allow potentially demolition of listed buildings, right the way through to destruction of archaeological sites. I mean, that could happen. But they had actually done a huge amount of planning beforehand, some 5 years of reports beforehand, before they ever started, in order to try and foresee every eventuality. And in the videos that I put up, I put the specific times to look at. You can see how they've used technology to protect the historic buildings, how they've done a huge amount of survey work beforehand to ensure that they had archaeologists on hand to do the archaeological work ahead of the tunnel boring machine. And this is an example of the type of planning they had. When you think that they had this for every part of 2 118-kilometre tunnels, it makes you realise how detailed, how really intensive this work was. So these brownie bits, these are scheduled ancient monuments. The yellow bits are conservation areas, and the purpley bits, they are listed buildings. All of these have to be protected in some way. And what has happened is the line has gone around them. So the line is not interfering with them, it's going around them. And it's counterintuitive, but it actually worked, because they worked together, the developers and the archaeology. It was actually given to 3 separate archaeology units. There are commercial archaeology units in Britain, and it was given to them to do the work. But a huge amount of work went into the planning before they ever started boring. This is doing so. They did test pits to see what the stratigraphic structure was. It was really very extensive. And this is an example, I think, of how we could look at development going in historic cities. And UNESCO tried in 2011, tried to think of a different way of thinking of our historic cities. And they came up with what was called the historic urban landscapes. Now, that probably, an urban landscape probably sounds like an oxymoron. Sounds a bit odd, doesn't it? But in fact, it makes a lot of sense, because when you have a natural heritage site in the environment, you wouldn't think of just listing that. I mean, you wouldn't list a waterfall, would you? Because you would have to list also, you would have to have some knowledge of, you know, where the water was coming from and where the water's going to. I mean, you know, you can't just separate that bit. And the problem with a lot of historic cities is that they've got monuments, but they've not been viewed holistically. And that is what historic urban landscapes is about, encouraging heritage practitioners to do. Because a holistic approach depends on the entire environment, both the tangible and the intangible. We've mentioned intangible cultural heritage before, and how it's being seen as being increasingly important. How you don't just want a monument that's a kind of sterile monument, you want it to have a life. Intangible cultural heritage are all the aspects of life that's, you know, makes it special for us. The rituals, the festivals, the clothes, the food, the music, all of these things are part of a rich culture. And urban heritage, if you use it to its full extent, incorporating all these elements, is a very rich economic asset for development. Development can use it and can really make it into something more than it would have been otherwise. And a city is an organic item. It's actually continually developing, and it's made, of course, by its people. So this is taken from the Historic Urban Landscape handbook that UNESCO put forward. And it's sort of saying you've got to put all this together: the economic aspect, the social values, the urban structures, all of it goes together. And of course, what is important, the most important element of all of this, are the people who live there. And they've got to be able to live there. They've got to be able to have a house. They've got to be able to have a job. They've got to be able to move around. And so we've got to find a way of allowing this to happen. So I want to just quickly go through one example of this historic urban landscape, which is King's Cross in London. 20 years ago, King's Cross was really in an awful state. It was an old industrial area. It was an area by train station in the middle of London, but in one sense, really prime development land, because right in the centre of London. But it had been industrial. The industry had moved out of London, but it was an area that wasn't really used for anything, and it had a reputation for drugs and prostitution and antisocial behaviour. But it was well placed, shall we say. And this is what it looked like 18 years. This is the difference 18 years can make. So at the top, you can see that it's very, very barren, and then down below you can see what it looks like today. But it was a pretty big challenge. Now, you could have just bulldozed everything away and put in a lot of skyscrapers, but that would have really ruined the area and the particular history of the area and what it could offer if you just make it exactly the same as, you know, every other high-rise city. It had some really unique features like these massive gas holders, which are pretty challenging. I don't know if you can see, but this is an example of like Victorian ironwork. And you see they actually make them like classical capitals. So they did some really sort of fancy ironwork there. I mean, they were very lovingly created, pretty challenging to repurpose, but they've now been made into apartments, and you know, they're very much sought after, in fact. I mean, if you imagine if you just like, you know, bulldoze them all down and put in, you know, a skyscraper, you wouldn't really have the same effect. And the whole area has been totally repurposed, but keeping most of the main old buildings. Some old buildings are really particularly industrial buildings like warehouses. They really do lend themselves very well to repurposing. And this is very important also in America, where there's a lot of old industrial buildings in the Rust Belt, which can be very nicely repurposed to other means. What they chose to do in King's Cross was to focus on the creative arts. So they moved there the University of the Arts and the St. Martin campus. St. Martin's is a very prestigious college of art, which has produced actually a lot of famous artists, but it's also very well known for its fashion. It's really the center of the London fashion industry. So they wanted to take the industrial vibe of this area and turn it to a 21st century creative use. And of course, there have been other big investment projects in new areas as well. I mentioned before the Louvre at Abu Dhabi, and our colleagues in Saudi Arabia. There have been many big investment projects there, which are using the heritage in order to develop a new economy, a post-fossil fuel economy, and to use this in creative ways that will move forward economic development. So you can see that we've come a long way from the idea that heritage and archaeology and historic buildings have to be in opposition to development. They can move along with development, and that's all a very positive outcome. But does this mean that all heritage investment works out? Well, no. Given you some very positive examples of where it can work, but it isn't always the case. And I'd like to move on now to finish by looking at different examples of, let me see if I can move this, of where it doesn't, always work. This is a very, very good book that I thoroughly recommend, Sophia Labadi, on rethinking heritage for sustainable development. And you can download it yourself because it's UCL Press, and UCL Press have now made all of their new books open access. So you can go online and put that in, and you will be able to download the book for free. Sophia Labardi analysed the long-term impact on development of UNESCO projects. She looked at 4. She looked at what were Millennium Development Goals in projects in Ethiopia, Senegal, Namibia, and Mozambique. And she found that, in fact, they did not produce they did not have the expected large-scale impact, and they did not have sustainable development results. So this is a situation where that is very sad and also very concerning, because these are exactly the areas where, you know, we are putting a lot of money now, in particular for the Sustainable Development Goals for 2030, and seeing them as areas that could get a heritage dividend. But the work that she has done, where she went back again after sort of 10 years of the project to see if it had really actually taken off on its own, and she found that almost universally it had not. And so that's a sort of concerning aspect. And why was that? How is it that they just were not successful in this way? Well, there were 3 or 4 things that were very common to all 4 projects. First of all, there was a tendency to use colonial categories to divide up natural and cultural, tangible, intangible, in a way that actually makes no sense in these communities. They applied development models from the global north, which were dictated really by the donors without really any regard for local conditions. And they focused a lot on individuals, ignoring the wider structural inequalities. So, for example, it really makes no sense to try and impose on a society to bring in individuals and train them in certain ways, if within that society they are never going to be able to establish themselves independently. This was true, for example, of their training of tourist guides. They, like many places, they thought that tourism would be what could kickstart the economy. But in actual fact, to set up tourist industries, you need a certain capital. You also need to be able to speak languages for the tourists. You might need transportation to make it work. So they set up projects that just could never be sustained afterwards. And so she makes some suggestions as to how we might improve this when we're looking at other societies. Of course, what really makes these societies different from the ones that I singled out before as being successful is that those societies had an infrastructure there. They had money to put into the project. And it's going to be very difficult if the country itself doesn't have that to keep the development going. And she felt very much that what needs to be done is to link in development to environmental sustainability, to inclusive social development, inclusive economic development, and the fostering of peace and security, because you're certainly not going to get people to go there if they don't feel that it's a secure environment. So to make it more holistic and to develop more the society, to see heritage not as static and unchanging, but as something that has a life and is organic, and in fact to use the traditions of the area instead of imposing rules from outside, to see the traditions of the area as a resource that can be used. And above all, to stop essentializing locals. Communities are often seen as like frozen in time and stereotypical, but in actual fact, you know, people move forward, and they shouldn't have these categories imposed upon them. And she felt there was a great lack of involvement of the local community. Oops, I'll just go back one. And as I say, all of this is really important because development at the moment is very geared towards the Sustainable Development Goals of 2030. So if we are not making it work, we need to understand the reasons why. Now, there isn't a separate Sustainable Development Goal for heritage, but it's usually incorporated into Target 11.4, which is to make cities and human settlements inclusive, resilient, and sustainable. And it's clear that in order for that to happen, there needs to be quite a sophisticated and a nuanced relationship between preserving the past and moving into the future and coming together. And I think that's the end. I'm gonna stop there, and I'm gonna stop sharing and go to, wow, we've got a lot in the chat. Ah, Peter is with us. Fantastic, he's just arrived. Hi, Peter. Oops, are you on mute? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, I don't know how much of that you heard.
I've been on for about a half an hour. So.
Oh, okay. Okay. You were just, this was just kind of gratuitous stress, is it? Because I couldn't see you on the screen, so I thought you weren't there. Okay, that was just to keep me on my toes. Okay. So to introduce Peter to everyone, Peter is someone who pre-COVID, he used to come and teach for us, but unfortunately we got grounded by COVID, but he is an expert in development, and he did his PhD on how heritage can be used in development. And so Peter, I'm interested to hear what you think about development. I know you know the Sophia Labardi book very well.
Intimately.
And one of the things that I tried to bring in is how development looks very different in different countries at different times. And it's whether you're positive or negative about it is going to depend on your situation. But what is your view?
Well, I think as you know, I was very much involved in helping Sophia get that book done, and I think it speaks in from its perspective to a more general experience that folks who've been trying to link heritage and development have had. If you'll recall, I was up until recently, I was a founding director of what was the Sustainable Preservation Initiative. It's now morphed into something called Escala, doing something completely different for many of the same reasons that she highlighted. There are a few institutions around the world who are trying to use heritage as a vehicle for economic development. And I think in one way or another, they're all running into the same classes of problems. And those are in addition to Sophia's list from her projects, more generally, the tendency to see development as something that is done to the local communities that are involved, to the people who live there, rather than by them and with them. A tendency to have transitory and short-term perspectives, even if that's measured as a decade or something. These are not, 2, 3, 5, 10-year projects. These are long-term projects, and a failure to recognize that if you're trying to generate development at a community level, you're talking about a skill issue. What really caused the metamorphosis of Sustainable Preservation Initiative was that it became clear that you couldn't really expect local people who were coming from a completely different place, educationally, culturally, career-wise, whatever, to pick up and run their businesses related to heritage well if they had absolutely no business skills. So we basically morphed from a here's the money, go solve your problem organization to a capacity building organization, to the extent that it became clear we'd have more impact training entrepreneurs generally than we would trying to focus on 10 or 20 people a year at heritage sites. And that's what they've done. So there's a core element of not recognizing that you have to build it from the bottom up in a very critical way. At the same time, you have to have what I call a supply chain associated with particularly with tourism functions, if that's where your development is coming from, because it's not enough just to go in and fix a building and assume people will come and be happy and taken care of and be able to get in and out safely and have a good dinner and have a good bed rest. You have to have the entire infrastructure of tourism for a site to have a hope of becoming viable. And we looked at a number of places during when SPI was in the early years that were highly desirous of becoming using tourism and their heritage resources to develop viable economies, but there was simply no feasible way for the commercial sector or even the government to justify the kind of investments necessary to make it happen. When you're in rural, developing context, those are the kinds of issues you run into: supply chains and capacity. And it's interesting, if you look at the World Bank literature on local and community driven development over the last 20 years, they pretty much come to the same conclusions, that it's very, very hard to do, and they don't really know how to do it consistently. If you get into urban context, you're dealing with very different kind of phenomenon. It very much depends on where you are and what the issues are and what the development is. I think in general, throughout the world, governments and local developers have been more successful at utilizing heritage fabric buildings and so forth in cities, both to preserve them and use them for development. What they haven't done such a good job at is avoiding the negative consequences, which generally run under the label of gentrification, and the sort of restructuring of who's living in these places as a consequence of that. That's really the big ethical and practical conundrum that falls out of the urban side. But anyway, that's a long-winded answer.
No, good. That speaks to very much what we've been talking about. Last week, we had a session on disaster and on how communities respond to disaster and what we can do to protect heritage from disasters, both sort of conflict, but also environmental disasters as well. And we had Rohit Jigyasa from ICFOM, who was our invited guest.
Right.
And he made a very interesting point. He said that, I asked him how we should respond to this, given that with climate change, these things are becoming more and more, of an issue. And he said, made an interesting point. He said that he felt in order to tackle this, he said, we need a new development paradigm. And so I asked him what that meant, a new development paradigm. And he said, well, we've got to stop seeing development as being measured solely by growth. And we've got to see development as being measured by well-being and various other factors. And at the moment, he felt that the problem is that almost the only metric we have to measure development growth. I wondered if you had any.
Yeah, I think he's right on in some critical respects. We measure development basically through the metric of gross domestic product per capita. That begins to take on political implications in most places, because if your GDP per capita is not going up, you're deemed to be losing productivity, losing the capacity to deal with social challenges, things like that. The problems with that are well understood, both from a technical standpoint as to what's included and what's not, but increasingly through the combination of Amartya Sen's view that development is really about capacity and not about capability. He calls it not about GDP. It's about, do you have the liberty to make a decision you want to make, which can include not developing in any conventional GDP per capita sense, but where that's a democratic choice of the people involved, not an imposed reality from the global economy. Wellness has become defining wellness is tricky, but it's become a really interesting discourse. New Zealand has adopted a wellness budget, as it's the way they're now viewing their economy, is through what are we doing to improve wellness, not what are we doing to enhance GDP per capita. There are various metrics that the OECD and others have developed to try to find alternative measures for this. But politicians kind of cling to GDP per capita because you can count it, and so do the economists because you can count it. And changing that paradigm is not going to be simple, because the alternative paradigms can imply that some people may not live as well as we might like them to, or they might want to, even if they're in fact happier in some sense. And this becomes a big philosophical and political discussion. But the drive for GDP per capita is going to be undermined, if nothing else, by the fact that we're having fewer and fewer capitas. I mean, China is now looking at a potentially, secular decline in the population of the country. That's going to radically change views of GDP per capita in the world's, currently largest country. Meanwhile, India is going to shortly be the world's largest country, and it has a whole set of challenges that are very, very different. So a new paradigm is a desirable thing. I think it's tough to get the world thinking that way, because economists don't know how to do anything else.
Yes. We've got an interesting comment in the chat that Bhutan might be. Bhutan's
another interesting case.
National happiness.
Gross national happiness. They've been doing that for a number of years. It's a very different place than France or England or the United States, but they are sort of the leading edge of this movement, I think.
Yes. I'm going to now ask our helpers in the chat, Melissa and Connor, do we have any, because the chat, there's lots and lots in the chat, which we can't sort of monitor, I can't monitor in real time. So I rely on Melissa and Connor to tell us, is there anything you would like to pick out that's come in the chat or the Q&A?
Yes, I think there's one question that Connor kind of fielded my way for you, that can be directed towards Peter as well. Are there any successful cases in rural contexts of the developing world, quote unquote, where we don't have large donors or sponsors of projects?
Define success, I think, is the problem. If you have, if you want to make the argument that success is, are there local rural initiatives that survive for a decent period of time and provide, employment and life upgrades to people? That's basically what my PhD was about. And the answer is that yes, they exist. They very much tend to be locally driven exercises by local folks pushing them and making them happen and organizing their own governance systems to do that. But I think the thing that has to be understood about all these things is everything has a half-life. I mean, one of the problems with the sustainability discourse is it acts as if sustainability is forever. If you have a community project that exists for 25 years, that's an extraordinarily long time in the real world. And what I've seen happen even with the projects that I studied is that changes from generation to generation not only can undermine them, it can make them irrelevant. Two of the projects I worked on, one in Peru and one in Belize, were expressly focused on enabling the women in the community to earn enough money to pay the tuitions to send their kids to school. Well, guess what the kids did? They moved to the big city and studied computer science. That's what any rational young person would do in today's world. And as a result, the communities have changed, and the need for these development projects is changing. And indeed, the communities themselves may cease to exist in their form or morph into something else. So there are cases, I believe, the ones that don't have massive amounts of money tied to tourism tend to be very local, very locally driven, and may not last for 50 years. They may last for a generation and have done their job.
Yeah,
Which
maybe
has nothing to do with heritage.
well, maybe we need to, start thinking in more realistic terms that we can't necessarily lay down something forever, and maybe 20 years is success, and people have to
That's
decide what they want to do with that.
That's right.
That way. We've got some in the question and answers. I think actually Peter just answered Lauren's one of specific examples that you think worked. I think the ones in your PhD work, didn't they? By and large.
Yeah, and the one that's still functioning, although it's been through its ups and downs, that's particularly interesting is because it's large, is the Val di Cornia park system in Italy, which is in my book. That was driven by a local combine of government bodies and individual businesses and other folks, and it has transformed that region and preserved a lot of the heritage, but not without some serious challenges to it politically and economically. These things exist, and they do exist all over the world, but they don't exist in the volume that a lot of the advocates of using heritage for development would like them to.
Right. So in fact, Peter's published the examples from his PhD in a book. You can look it up under Gould P, which is called something very similar to this, isn't it? Sort of what's it called?
It's called Empowering Communities Through Archaeology and Heritage.
Well,
there it is.
Last week I couldn't remember, my own book, so that's don't take it personally. Melissa, I'll go back to you, or you or Connor. Do you have any other questions that have come through that you'd like to direct our way?
Yes, there's been a few people that have been asking for some other recent examples of countries that are grappling with their dark heritage aside from Eastern Europe and Nazi Germany.
Their dark heritage?
Yes.
How about the United States?
Yeah. Their difficult pasts, yes.
Oh, I see. They're different, right. Specifically with regard to development, is that?
Yes.
I see. Well, I suppose certainly Balkan countries have, in particular Croatia. There's quite I think we've got several people from Albania, I think, with us tonight, because certainly I have some friends who have worked quite hard in promoting the communist heritage of Albania, which is absolutely fascinating, I may say. And they seem to do very well out of it, in fact. So I don't know any other places that specifically, the Balkan countries, of course, you know, have been recovering that kind of heritage, and Eastern Europe, but I think you mentioned that, didn't you? So for example, in Sarajevo, I know that's quite a factor, but I don't really know. Do you know any, Peter?
Well, you can think about southern Mexico and the conflicts on the Maya lands borders, and Richard Leventhal's project in Teosuco around the caste war, the resistance in Oaxaca to the if you will, the authorized heritage discourse from the central government in Mexico versus the Maya heritage in that region. I think you can look in much of the world where localities have enough independence to assert themselves, and you're going to find efforts to deal with localized issues that they could fall into the dark heritage rubric.
Yeah. Some people have mentioned in the chat Spain, of course, Spain dealing with Franco. Yeah, that's very good. So Peter, you're sounding sort of do you have any hope at all?
Hope? Do I have any hope? I think the challenge of one of the challenges is, how do you project development down to the level where it can stick while building whatever infrastructure is necessary and maintaining the financing? And that because the big challenge is money comes from people who have money, whether it's governments or individuals, and they tend to assert their own views of what should happen. And that tends not, I think history has shown that's not a very successful strategy. By the same token, what we learned at SPI is trying to do it, you know, quote unquote, bottom up, and without creating the capacity, without providing the financial resources, without dealing with the infrastructure, is an equally fallacious approach. I think, you know, Sophia's book outlines, you know, pretty soberly what doesn't work in that realm. And I think that that in order to, it is partly a matter of shifting the paradigm. It is also partly a matter of thinking about the structures through which we attempt to use heritage for this purpose. And I'm viewing it from a proactive point of view of trying to use heritage for development. The structures through which we do that, the way we finance it, and trying to find intermediate ventures. I'm being a little vague because I'm just starting on a project to try to figure out the answer to that question, looking at national trusts as a model. But we have to have a different way to do this. Now, when you get into the question of you know, urban development in places where there already is a vibrant economy and you're trying to rescue things from being mowed down for skyscrapers, that's a different conversation. That's a whole different set of problems. It's all about placemaking. It's all about dealing with the gentrification problem. In many respects, it's a lot simpler, but that's because you're trying to do something in the context of a place that's already vibrant to some degree, or easily made more vibrant. The rural areas, that's a whole different conversation.
I mean, I think the problem is, and we've come up against this point in other arguments that we've had in these presentations, is that the whole concept of heritage and how we deal with it and develop it, it grew up in a particular environment in the West. And once you start applying it out of that context, we don't appreciate enough the difficulties that will come with that. We think that because it's worked in one place, it's going to work in another place. And we're just not sufficiently good at analyzing ourselves and our models and our ways of thinking to actually see that you can't implant that in other areas. I mean, I think that's something that's come up. I know that Rohit has talked a lot, and also Aparna Tandon, at Ecom have talked a lot about the problems that they have in working in disaster areas with kind of Western people who just think that you have to impose a model that was developed in a completely different environment, you know, and I think that's what we keep coming up against all the time, really, this inability to adapt, inability to see the difference. So I think it's kind of a bit of a theme, really. Would you be interested in, because one of the things that we are thinking of doing, we've had a lot of interest in these presentations, and there are some particular themes coming through, and so we're hoping to have a discussion. I hope you would be able to join us about whether we should have new development paradigms and what they should be. We do. So I'm inviting you to, when we organise this, with Rohit has said he would be interested in doing it, because I asked him to elaborate upon what he thought would work. And so I hope you might be able to join us in that in a few weeks.
Sounds great. Sounds great.
So I'll go back to Melissa for one last question. Melissa.
Okay. Here's a good one. How do you define significance in determining what structures are to be preserved if how the determination of significance is made is based on the developer complying with specified procedures to make that determination?
Well, personally, I would say it's not the developer that makes those decisions. So I've got a really easy answer to that question. Was the developer should not be making decision on the significance of a heritage building, but I don't know what Peter would say.
At least if I don't know a great deal about how this is done in other places. In the United States, it tends to be either, I mean, there's a limited national suite of buildings and places that are being protected under various heritage laws. Most of that is done at the local level, and most of it is done, almost all of it, not all of it, almost all of it tends to be in the form of districts that have been designated as historic, and pretty much anything inside the district is subject to oversight from a historic preservation commission or something like that. And those folks tend to try in general to enforce preservation of the envelope, sometimes preservation of the interior, depending on where you are, and that's done geographically. Now the British system, which you probably know more about than I, Val, but the British system, which does have tens of thousands of listed buildings at various levels, tends to be a building by building decision that is made, you know, inside the bureaucracy with, you know, I presume on nomination from someone. But once you are listed, particularly at a top level, you have to touch base with the local heritage officers to, you know, to do anything. And that's probably a more extreme version of what I see here as a district wide, you know, area to be preserved and otherwise. And we have extensive zoning in the United States that often protects other kinds of structures and limits what can go on. So in Philadelphia, for example, even in the areas that aren't in the historic district, you're not going to go in and willy-nilly mow down a bunch of row houses and put up a big hotel. It's just not going to happen because the zoning commission won't permit it.
Yeah. I think that's I think for urban heritage, I think it is pretty well covered. Where I think it's less well covered is particularly rural and coastlines and areas that are going to be affected by climate change. I think that starts to get much more difficult. And I think we're going to have to, as time goes on, particularly when the impact of climate change becomes more apparent, we're probably going to have to make harder choices, shall we say, on this. That's really for sure. Right. Okay, I think we have to stop there because my colleagues have to go and have their dinner. So thank you, everyone. again, absolutely fantastic comments in the chat. Everyone's thanking you, Peter, for
My
this
pleasure.
intervention. And on Thursday we have our last one, which is going to be on peace building. So something positive. Thank you also to the backroom gang who make this happen, as you know, to Harry in particular, and Melissa, who does a brilliant job, and Connor and Sama, who do back up for us. Thank you all, and thanks, Peter, and hopefully we're going to see you again.
Good enough.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.